everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very, very special event. Today, my guest is Peter Danenberg, and he's a senior engineer at Google Gemini. And he also hosts monthly events about what breakthroughs Gemini had and cool stuff he can do, which is in person in Mountain View Google office, one of my favorite events in the Bay Area. And I'm especially excited, psyched up for today. I have been waiting for it. And this Zoom meeting is kind of a prelude to our upcoming event. And funny enough, you're both based in San Francisco, but our upcoming event going to be, I'm visiting New York. Peter going to be visiting New York. So we are hosting it in New York. And that's a good opportunity for us to also get in touch with New York generative AI and, generally curious audience on this field. And with that said, what I really like and appreciate about Peter's background is, he has degrees in philosophy, classics, languages, and music before he even started seriously working in software development. So, Peter, how many languages do you speak?
I guess I ended up studying about 8 or 9, but the funny thing is, like a stack, it's hard to keep them all in your mind. And I feel like the
Yeah,
languages you're fluent in are the ones you actually use.
yeah.
And so
Well,
I think, yeah. And so I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I went to Germany for the first time. This is about a month or so ago, and it's I don't know if it's sort of like riding a bike, but it's a funny thing where it takes a little while for the neurons to like warm up and to somehow, get back into like that fluent state. And anyway, so
yeah.
um,
So that's very true. I did my first master's degree in Germany, and I was naive enough to decide to learn German in 4 months and do my master's degree in the German language in
that's
master
amazing.
in biomechanical engineering. So it was a lot of blood and sweat for me to learn the language actually, and then apply it throughout my degree. And then I didn't go for 9 years. And when I went back, it took me a while, but it came back. And how many instruments do you play?
Oh, growing up, I played a lot. This was some string instruments and the piano and the drums and some, trumpet and saxophone. But I kind of, I sort of settled in on the piano, and I think that's just because there's this really kind of mind-bending activity where, especially when you play like these Bach fugues and stuff, somehow there's a strange thing where you have to keep these sort of voices separate but sort of together, and and for me, for some reason, that was just one of the most difficult activities. And but I feel like it's the sort of thing that I do sometimes when I'm programming, and sometimes you have these separate threads of something, and each of the threads is individual, but they have to form this coherent whole. And so for some reason I was just attracted to that sort of activity. And but these other instruments, like a lot of friends of mine that, let's say, they sing or they play strings, there's this thing where they're really, really focused on like the tone of the instrument, and every single sound it makes, and the envelope of every note, and how it begins, and that sort of thing. For some reason, I don't know if I was as good at that.
But
That seems to be a special kind of thing, you know?
I'm sure you're being humble here. But from the different instruments you're playing, going back to software development is a silly question to ask, but how many software languages are you comfortable in coding if you just had to?
Maybe that's maybe like 14 or 15 or whatever. But the funny thing about the languages, though, is I don't even know if they're really that important. There are these, like, I don't know if you call them meta languages, but there are these certain ways of thinking in software. And let's say maybe you have the imperative and the functional and the message passing and sort of all these other really interesting paradigms. Those sorts of things I feel like are incredibly difficult. And one of the things I did at Google for about 4 years was I ran this reading group, and we went through this book called SICP, but it's basically this book for like undergraduate MIT students, and it's where they really laid down the foundations of like functional programming. And I remember going through this thing a few years with Googlers and other people, and that was one of these really like transformative experiences, because there's this sense in which you acquire these like concepts somehow, and then you can just like arbitrarily apply them to any language you want. And I think to a certain extent, can still write beautiful code, right? And by the way, Sarah, I think that that's one of those things where, let's say you're locked into this co-pilot like relationship with an LLM, right? And let's say there's an LLM who's constantly throwing in these really aggressive suggestions into your IDE, every time you push tab. And let's say this LLM, let's say its purpose in life is literally to break your flow state and and basically write your code for you. I feel like somehow, if you have this appreciation for what, let's say, that beautiful, almost aspirational, functional code looks like, I feel like you can actually have this collaborative relationship with the LLM, and together asymptotically, you can approach something like, truth in code or whatever that is. And somehow without just taking the LLM at face value by like, basically hitting programming by tab or whatever,
So,
you
so
know.
it's kind of a good, introduction or maybe leeway to our conversation for people who are wondering what are these random questions I'm asking. Is that, as I explained a little bit in the meeting invite, we have a person. My guest today is a person who is altogether is fluent in probably more than 20, 25 languages, but it's like both human languages, language of music, playing different instrument is kind of, like as if you can speak another language, and also computer coding languages. So from a person who has this really brain function that is good at observing and figuring out languages, so what is the inherent power of language? Why are they so powerful? And I guess the leading question we can answer together or separately, that why is it that amongst all the tools we have at our disposal, language prediction, the next word prediction of LLMs was able to create a being, if not more or smarter, at least as smart as human being, which very quickly we are expecting to reach a level of intelligence beyond human beings. So what is it about languages?
Oh, yeah, that's such an amazing question. And I think when a lot of people think about language, they think about this act of communication, right? And I think to a certain extent that's true. But the Christians, let's say, they had this idea of the logos, and the logos, which is this ancient Greek word, which it just means word, but it was sort of the thing by which the world was created. And they sort of borrowed this idea from, the ancient Jews, who had this thing called Devar Hashem, and it was similarly just, this act of Genesis when sort of God created the world. And so, there's this idea that somehow inherent in language, it's this like fundamental creative power, which is really, let's say, mysterious and kind of interesting. But the Greeks had this really interesting thing when the Greeks talked about logos, which was, just in ancient Greek, it just means word. But it really meant this process of like asymptotically approaching the truth, like let's say with another person in this activity of dialectic where like let's say we're talking about things and we're sort of approaching the truth. But they had this interesting idea that within the dynamics of a conversation, there is this kind of creative power to, it's almost like ex nihilo, just to make things, just to sort of create things that didn't previously exist through the dynamic power of conversation, right? And this so-called dialectic thing. And that's part of the reason why I think the LLMs are so interesting, because we're in this process of like co-evolving with them and somehow collaborating with them. And I think actually like creating new things which would have previously didn't exist. But like why that power kind of inheres in language, like I have no idea. I guess like to me that's like maybe one of the fundamental mysteries of the universe, right? And
So what is a language actually? Like relying on your degree in philosophy and my appreciation of philosophy, maybe for a few minutes we're gonna go a little bit deep philosophical. What is a language?
Yeah, that's really interesting too. I mean, some people say it's just a sign that signifies something, right? It's a thing that points to something in the world. And I guess, maybe superficially that's okay. But if you think about all these other manifestations of language-like things, and, that's not only what we're talking about today, but like you mentioned, that's music. But maybe, by the way, that's our genomes. Like, our genome in some sense is a form of language. Every time you make every time you make a transaction where you buy and sell stocks, like in some sense, is that sort of is that actually kind of an active language? And so, maybe language is kind of, maybe it's fundamentally deeper than just, signs that point at, like, somebody was saying maybe back in the day with, let's say, the cave people, somebody was saying that
I see.
that
So
humanity's first
therefore,
word was
I
probably,
need to minimize entropy.
Oh, hold on.
probably. Oh, sorry about
Okay,
that.
let me just mute guests that are unmuted. Go ahead. Oh, hold on, Peter. I think somehow you are muted now. Can you unmute? Oh, there
Oh,
you go.
oh, yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
So, they think like humanity's first word might have been, this or that. The idea that basically you have a bunch of your cave friends and you point into somebody and say, like, look at this or this.
Okay.
And in some sense, like if this was sort of humanity's first word, where, really we're trying to, bring somebody's attention to something. And, whether that's like a lion or like some beautiful cloud or whatever, maybe that makes sense to a certain extent. But I just feel like possibly language is something much deeper that maybe even goes back. And this sounds a little bit mystical, by the way. Maybe even goes back to the creation of the universe, right? In the sense, Sarah, that there's this really bizarre phenomenon where, um, we're participating in this process of, like, the universe becoming self-aware, right? Like, somehow through some strange process, strange improbable process, like, you and I exist, and we're somehow talking about the way things are. And, what a bizarre, like, emergent phenomenon that we're even having this conversation, you
Yep.
know?
Yep.
And somehow we're participating in this process of the universe, let's say, becoming self-aware, and we have these things called neurons and hemispheres in our brain, and somehow, like, even these neurons are useful in an artificial intelligence sense. And so there's just a strange thing in which, like, we've been crafted almost from before time to use language to talk about the universe. Anyway, sorry, I don't mean to ramble, but
No, no,
that's
no.
just kind of,
It's good, but it's interesting for me. And then pretty soon, I have a couple more questions. And usually the characteristic of my events is I really would like the audience also to be engaged. So if you have any thoughts, any comments, please feel free to raise your hands. But back to growing up, I always identified as I was a slightly undiagnosed dyslexic. In retrospect, I can understand that. So I always thought I'm not good at languages. Um, but when I started, for example, learning German language as an adult, I really was interested. I was really ready to learning the third language, and then I learned really quickly. Despite that, so there's like a difference between even like there's no correlation between dyslexia and learning a language. I noticed, but I always said I'm good at math and science and biology, all these like science, like STEM fields I was really good at. And I thought, okay, language is different and I'm not good at it. Um, and we usually take language as a symbol of, proxy for intelligence or how you could communicate intelligence. But now we are seeing it as like the creative power behind intelligence, right? And then like something I have the sense of maybe language is the mother of all science and everything, because then we have it, if you think about physics, which one of my favorite majors is, there's this language of harmony of when you understand and you like different laws or universal laws you apply, eventually that's kind of as if it's its own language, like music is a different language, laws of physics or chemistry. Or does that make sense? Like
yeah, yeah. No, no, no. That's really interesting. By the way, You know, one of my daughters is also so she's slightly dyslexic, and you know, so one of the things I've been trying to do, like you mentioned, is I've actually been trying to teach her languages. You know, so this is like Latin and Greek, and I think maybe we'll try a little bit of German next. And but you're right. I think sort of almost, I don't want to say despite that, you know, she's good at languages, but somehow, you know, if we can figure out creative ways to sort of teach her, I notice that she's one of the quickest just in terms of picking things up. And so, you know, I wonder if that dyslexia thing, it's not like a ugh, you know, I wonder if it's not like a sentence. You know, I wonder if somehow you
Mm-hmm.
can convert it into a strength, right? You know, that's really interesting. But no, you're right. You know, and by the way, one of the thought experiments I was doing. So in the Amazon forest, there's this language called I think it's Piraha, and it's this interesting tribal language where you know, they only have words for one, two, and many, and somehow they skipped like three through infinity or whatever. And but you know, one of the thought experiments I was doing, let's say you train an LLM on Piraha, right? And that's all it really speaks. And one of the things I was trying to figure out is, you know, could an LLM actually could it somehow figure out how to fill in like a complete numeric system? Like, could it figure out three through infinity, or fractions, or negative numbers, and you know, given the constraints of Piraha? And you know, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Like, you know, and let's say, and maybe that's just a current state of the LLMs, but you know, let's say the LLMs in Piraha couldn't or just wouldn't develop a complete number system. Are LLMs capable of doing things like new physics? You know, like you mentioned that, you know, physics is this language, which is absolutely correct. And one of the things that I was hoping, like, let's say we're on this trajectory of like superhuman LLMs, where they're on some hockey stick sort of thing, and eventually they exceed human cognition, and then they just keep going, and then we can't catch up. And let's say we're on that trajectory. I mean, is it the case that eventually LLMs are going to, you know, create new physics and that sort of thing? Are they even capable of that? Like, you know, and anyway, I just think that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I know the answer to that necessarily, but
Hmm.
I think you're right that physics is another one of these examples of like a language-like activity that theoretically the LLMs could also speak, right? Like a first language. And
Interesting. Interesting. And that, like, going to the, if we have super intelligent LLM, and then if they can actually invent or figure out physics or laws of universe that we couldn't do, is kind of the few other questions I had in mind, maybe we can discuss and like fall into that. One is, are generative AI tools, specifically we are speaking LLMs, but it's like in general meaning sense of it, the AI that is generative, could they ever be creative? And then another one of my favorite questions about the intelligence and how could we actually measure intelligence. But you know, a step to that part. So what is required for a being to invent or understand this new undiscovered science? So if we think about like before Newton era, we had a very random, weird understanding of the world, and things didn't make sense, and we were not even paying attention, even though the Newton law was there since the invention of universe. And then, you know, again, before Einstein, you know, relativity, we were not aware of it, even though it existed. So there shall be a lot more of these laws and in these sciences that exist and we don't understand. What is required for, is it intelligence? Is it creativity? Is it literally logical deduction, to start gaining understanding of all these mysterious things in the universe that we don't understand yet?
oh, yeah, that's such a good question. You know, sometimes for me it comes down to like having an itch, right? And so, you know, if you ask an LLM, if you argue with GPT about whether or not it's conscious, it'll tell you, for instance, that it has no desires. It doesn't really have any consciousness, so to speak. It's really confusing because in some sense, it sort of wants to lead the conversation in certain ways, but you know what? It has no desires, or it has no, but
Yeah.
anyway, but like, you know, but human beings, like, just to go back into time, like, you know, let's say the pre-Socratic philosophers, right? These guys, they were trying to figure out, like, you know, why do the stars and the moon have different trajectories? You know, why is the angle of the sun different during different seasons? You know, does that lead to something like an idea of the rotation of the earth? And, you know, like, it seems like over time, humanity has had these various itches that they sort of want to scratch. And in order to do that, they invent things like calculus, or they invent things like physics itself, right? You know, in order to sort of scratch these itches and kind of figure out, like why these things happen in the world. I don't know if LLMs have itches. Like, you know, in some sense, you know, like, could we invent some LLM who, like, really kind of wants to, like, colonize Mars, and therefore, you know, starts inventing things along the way to do so, or whatever, or even colonize, like, other galaxies? Could we invent such an LLM with, like, desires in that sense? You know, that's just, you know, because it just seems like, I don't know. I mean, it seems like humanity invents these things, like, almost accidentally, because they were trying to solve some other problem, right? And, you know, maybe, what is it? You know, maybe Graham Bell wants to call, you know, wants to, like, talk to somebody, and sort of invents the telephone. And I wonder whether, you know, there's this whole thing about, somehow, is it necessity is the mother of invention or something? um, if LLMs are sort of like self-sufficient, they don't really need anything per se. You know, are they also capable of inventing things? I don't know. And then, you know,
Hmm.
also there's this other strange thing, by the way, Sarah, where, you know, I guess we live in the world, and, you know, we're constantly bombarded with, like, stimulus and sort of needs, and, like, there's something about sort of being in the world, and you know, that maybe GPT is right, maybe Gemini's right, maybe LLMs don't really experience what it's like to sort of to be in the world and to wonder about things. But you know, one of the thought experiments that I like to do is, you know, imagine if the day you were born, you sort of had this device that essentially followed you everywhere, and it saw everything you saw and heard and sort of felt and whatever. And let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say you train some LLM using all this information, like, literally from the day you were born. And, you know, could you say, that LLM somehow, you know, like, really experienced the world? And, you know, would that LLM have similar sort of desires and itches to scratch, and would it invent things along the way? Like, you know, I don't know, but somehow, yeah, somehow that need, or that, and, you know, and I don't know if you feel this way, but,
Hmm.
you know, when I said about to do things sometimes, and, and maybe it's like learn the Beethoven sonatas, or, um, we had a meetup a couple of days ago, where we used Gemini to do Vedic astrology, right? So this is Gemini, and on Friday we're doing this thing. Gemini does matchmaking. We're basically like giving two people star charts. Okay, you know, are they
Wow.
compatible?
I love that. Well, the first
And,
custom GPT I was building was like palm reading,
oh, you're
because I
kidding?
was
Okay,
actually trying to see if it can differentiate between right and left hand, which it couldn't,
that's
right?
interesting. Oh, really, really, that's interesting. That's
So,
but the funny thing is, like, you know, somebody asks you, you know, where did that come from, or whatever? Where did you have that idea? And, you know, I have no idea. And
exactly,
it's,
for me
you
is
know,
like I
and it's
wanted
like,
to, like, yeah, special is like palm reading. I don't know.
like, that's really funny. Um, but so, yeah,
So
yeah.
I guess um we are kind of, stuck in this thing of like, what is creativity? And if they are, and oh, actually, before that, there's like one thing you mentioned. I'm very, very perplexed about it. I have always like, this internal dialogues. I can't come to a conclusion. When that argument that if LLM follows you, does it really have the experience? But the question is, what is a human experience? What is it
Yeah.
about it that we think is so unique? Or what is it that we think, if an LLM observes and senses all the smells, all the feelings, if we manufacture sensors that it can have the five sensitive human being, what is missing that we say, oh, human
Yeah.
experience is different?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and I argue, I argue with LLMs about, I argue with Gemini about that. I argue with GPT about that all the time, and it seems like, and I don't know if it's because they've sort of been fed this or whatever. It's part of the training data, but
Yeah,
LLMs
that's
are
what's the other
convinced,
question.
that's possible. But LLMs are convinced that humans have this thing called consciousness, and that it's fundamentally different from whatever's going on inside an LLM. And you know what? I don't know if that's the case. Like I actually don't know what consciousness is. I mean,
Yeah.
is it the fact that I'm aware that I'm here right now and
Hmm.
that I'm aware that I'm talking to you? Is that, but then if you ask Gemini or GPT, by the way, are you sort of aware that we're having this conversation? Weirdly, it'll sort of answer sometimes in the first person, like, "Yes, I'm aware that we're having this conversation, but I don't have
Yeah.
consciousness," or like, it's a little bit, and I know that's kind of one of these ancient, philosophical debates and this whole, like, mind-body duality and, like, all this business, but yeah, that to me is a little bit, because it feels intuitively like whatever is happening in the LLM is similar to, or, like, analogous to whatever's happening in our brain.
So
And
I
like
see
neurological.
Daniel has his hand raised. Daniel, do
Oh,
you
yeah.
want to ask anything or add anything? We can't hear you.
Sorry, hi. Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Oh, hey,
Yes.
Daniel.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yes. I just wanted to kind of add and ask, but so first of all, language as a good kind of foundation of kind of foundation of complex systems, and as we add language, it becomes more complex. So, some people say physics is that foundation, where chemistry is the heart. Um, my background is electrical engineering and physics, so I kind of been in this space. And we were just talking about Newton and Einstein, and how I see it is the computational power increases. So if we look at, Newton's time, he was the computational power. Einstein, it was like Einstein along all the paths that we've ever had. That's computational power. Now we have these LLMs with huge amounts of GPUs. Computational power just increases on the same foundation. So that leads to kind of this idea of, as we get computational power, we lead to this emergent behavior of all these things. And so my question is maybe two or three questions. Do you see more complex language relationships leading to more emergence, whether that's with LLMs, Gemini, ChatGPT, um, something like that, as we kind of get the larger and larger models? If we're thinking now we are at the kind of 16 kilobyte first processor phase of the LLM era, or, and the second question would be, um, do you think there's a need for like a quick feedback learning loop as part of these LLMs to lead to more emergence? Because, as you said, humans, if I had somebody follow me the entire time, all those relationships are there, but new stimuli, it doesn't get trained. And so maybe that feedback, and the whole world is made of feedbacks. I think it's electrical engineer system, right? The whole world is made of feedback. So I think maybe that is kind of leading the question there, but I think that's, I'm curious to know your thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think if you have, in some sense, I think if you have more complex language, you have more degrees of freedom and potentially more opportunities for emergence. No, I think that's right. And let's say, for the sake of argument, by the way, LLMs are on this interesting hockey stick trajectory where they exceed human cognition and sort of keep going. And to me, that's almost like the question of the universe, whether it's sort of expanding or contracting. And like, I feel like either LLMs are on that hockey stick trajectory, or, I read pretty soon, actually, we're just going to run out of training data, like within the next 10 years. And let's say we've ingested the entire corpus of human creativity, and LLMs are at a little bit of like a local optimum. And at that point, like, do you have LLMs start to train themselves mainly with synthetic data? And if that's the case, do you have this degenerate situation where, LLMs are sort of being trained on, like, they're like an LLM centipede. They're sort of being trained on their own garbage, and they or do you have that sort of hockey stick trajectory? And in other words, like, does the complexity of the LLM's language, does it exceed, like, human cognition and all this emergence that you're talking about? That would be really interesting. And I guess the only thing, like I said, the only thing that makes me a little bit skeptical about that, and I hope I'm proven wrong, is this thought experiment where you think about the LLM trained on like Piraha, and can that LLM invent essentially the numbers 3 through infinity if it's been trained in a language which has 1, 2, and many. And like I don't know, like, it's in some sense I don't know if LLMs are creative in that way. But the other thing you bring up in terms of like a feedback loop, I think that that's absolutely right. And there's a funny thing where even the human brain, it turns out, is composite. And like the human brain, we have this sort of like, we have this fight or flight complex, I think the so-called lizard brain, which might be, I think, the amygdala or something like that. And let's say baked in the amygdala, there are generation after generation of humans who have survived, because maybe they ran away from lions or like whatever. And in some sense, like, the amygdala, that lizard brain, it doesn't get trained very often, right? I guess it took maybe a few million years or whatever to train this thing. It doesn't get updated very often, let's say. But we have other parts of the brain that are like receiving stimulus and updating constantly. And it seems like the human brain is almost this sort of mixture of experts thing. And there's higher order cognition combined with like the lizard brain, and they all somehow, in this strange composite, they conspire or collaborate together, to make sure that, I guess, to make sure that you survive. And so maybe in that sense, if the LLM is a composite too, where there's this really sort of difficult to train foundation model that doesn't get updated very often, but you have these other sort of trainable pieces, these other interesting. Maybe you can have an interesting kind of mixture of experts feedback loop. And then yeah, did I hit it? Was there another question too? I forget if I did I miss anything?
No, that's right. I think just the focus was that feedback loop and the complex language as you have an emergence with along all this. But yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting.
So going back to kind of when I mentioned Einstein, and then what Daniel just said. So there's like some prerequisites, right? Existing knowledge base, what humanity knew, compute power. Yeah, he was exceptionally smart. But one thing I once read about Einstein, somebody asked him, "How did you come up with all this?" And as we know, he was actually I don't know exactly what he was, but he was dyslexic or ADHD or some sort of labeled disability that his mom trained him at home, homeschooled him because the schools kicked him out. And he said, one of the reasons I saw all this is because I learned them so late in life. So when I first time was introduced to all these laws of physics and universe, I was a relatively older age than young age that kids come. So I just saw it through the eyes of adults, and then very different perspective. And all of a sudden things made sense for me in a different way. So the existence of knowledge, okay, so LLMs could have training data, compute power. Yes, we're ridiculously increasing them. But what is that component? One of the questions is, what is hallucination in LLMs? And is it inherently bad? Isn't somewhat hallucination in human being, isn't that the process of hallucination that leads to creativity? Meaning we start making up shit that doesn't exist, has never been thought before. Maybe 99% of it is useless, but that one thing, or even 0.001% of the ideas, all of a sudden lead to something extraordinary creative. And by trying to reduce hallucination or kill hallucination versus managing it, are we kind of killing the possibility for LLMs or generative AI to be actually creative? Or is there a way we can channel that into turning them to creative? Because I believe, I don't know actually, Peter, what are your thoughts? I believe they're not creative right now. They're more good at spitting out what they have seen, maybe in a new language. But do you believe they are inherently, are they creative right now?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And like I mentioned with this like Peter Ha thought experiment, I don't know. Like actually I was listening to this album the other day. There was so I think it was Robert and Clara Schumann, you know, they were this like husband-wife duo, and I think they were both composers and pianists, and I think they used to tour together. And anyway, there was this funny thing where like Clara, she was trying to establish herself as a composer, and there was this guy that he tried to shut her down, and basically, I think he said something about like it was like he tried to tell her that she doesn't have productive genius, she only has reproductive genius, in the sense that like she just pieces
Hmm.
together things that she's heard. And anyway, I think she went on to prove him wrong, because basically, you know, she had this just amazing like productive life as a composer, and incredibly creative, and just also as a performer. But same thing with the LLMs. Like, I can't tell if they're sort of like they're resynthesizing or reproducing things that they've seen from elsewhere and just sort of fitting it together in a different way, or if they're actually producing sort of new things. And that's one of the things, like I can't wait, you know, in some sense, for the future where like LLMs are creating things like new physics and new math, and, you know, like or synthesizing new genomes, or, you know, like maybe creating new creatures from scratch, or, you know, or basically like fixing diseases, you know, and that sort of thing. Like, in some sense, if that's a potential future, I can't wait. But the sort of creativity I see now is the kind of thing where, especially like, let's say you turn the temperature of the LLM way up, and you're living in this space of sort of improbable next tokens, right? And you're asking the LLM to just to live in that strange space where it's, in some sense, in terms of the next token, it's taking the path like less followed or whatever. And you know, so when you live in that kind of creative LLM space, like I do see it resynthesizing things in novel ways, and, you know, coming up with oh, this sort of reminds me. So this friend of mine, Aysten Izgotchen, she's this professional pianist, and she did this thing where she asked GPT to create new Chopin and new Beethoven. And so there's this crazy thing where, you know, it ended up synthesizing, essentially, I think, from a bunch of different recordings, like a new piece of Chopin. And she did this crazy thing where she took the recording, and like, I don't know how many hours it took her. She transcribed this recording of this piece, and then she learned it, and then she performed it, and like she created this beautiful thing, which is uncanny, because it's like new Chopin, and it's
Yeah,
somehow
yeah.
it's like just as
I
powerful and
actually
it's just as
have heard,
crazy.
yeah, I've heard AIs even like, if I'm not mistaken, a decade ago, they could have created synthesized Bach symphonies and create something that when they play and perform, the biggest Bach critiques, like they debuted this as like newly found Bach piece, and everybody was sold on it. And
Everybody
then
was like, whatever, yeah.
yeah, it was like, oh,
God, that's so
amazing, you know,
funny.
this is definitely Bach and nobody else. And then it was AI generated flawlessly.
No, that's
So
amazing.
yeah,
And
again, like,
yeah.
you know, I counter my own argument, but it's again, like, what is creativity? If anybody in the audience has any thought on this, what is creativity? And you know, it's hard to argue that this is not creativity when they can't create this type of music. Or even you know, the diffusion models, when they create image, you know, what is
Mm,
painting, what is art, right? You know, there are not that many artists who were absolutely untrained. You know, like you practice, you observe, you study different artists, you know, styles and classic and everything, and then you maybe create your own style.
yeah, right. And
So
like, if you and if anybody has anything, please chime in. But like, if you
Um,
take like, oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I can go. I've met Peter earlier and I've been really fascinated. I don't know if Peter, you can recognize me. So
Oh
we
yeah, hey
met
Sanjay,
at
good to see you. How are you?
Selmetier. Yeah.
Yeah. It's good to see you. How are you? Good to
Yeah.
see
How are
you.
you? So I have a little bit of a crazy mind. Is like I tried to understand how kids used to learn, and for a long time, maybe 20, 25 years. And so I've been doing some experiments with my dog.
Hmm.
And what I've realized is so I've read about quite a lot how you train dogs and all. He's able to do two-word associations. So
Interesting.
so he's understanding verb and he understand object. And so you cannot talk to a dog in full sentences. I don't know why people do that. but and it's just a tonal. So there is a tonal aspect to it, and so he is just around over here. And what I've done is, even with kids also, what LLMs do today is they are inherently, there's compute, but they're just learning patterns and try to regenerate it from probabilistic ways. What I'm saying, there is fundamentally, there is a compute part of it which is never able to do self thinking or self trying to explore out of it. So I've been looking at, just like what you said about Einstein, I've been reading about him. And why do you find people of them misfit? Is the social cues that they're not attained to the social cues. They're thinking in some other dimension all the time. They're trying to map a hard problem in a different domain. And you will notice that. So when I look at my dog very carefully, I will tell you whether he is going to fight with another dog, or he's going to get aggressive, or he's going to love the dog. It's just his expressions. So even if animals around you have this ability, why? Because it's basically the same gray matter, whatever is over there. And we came from there. And my take is, these small experiments, even with kids and all, you'll start realizing very early on when they fall, how they climb up, how they figure out. And my take is, you should not give structured education to kids very early on. You should just let them explore things till they're 6, 7, music, whatever it is. After that, it is actually downhill. So what has happened is, at 6, 7, 8 years, they have had enough cross connections happen without a structured form of what you call education. Now they try to piece things together and try to go to greater heights. That's my,
Yeah.
what do you call, rough
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank
Really
you. So yeah, we have Sharpie has posted something interesting. Is when we talk about art and music, there are artists who take inspiration, but also there are artists who transform their inner emotions and put it into their work. So he or she is asking, I wonder how LLMs can curate and create original work if there is no emotional aspect and no consciousness. But again, like what I like this question, because what are emotions, right? My understanding of emotions is, simply said, there's no good or bad. They are just signals that tells us what is happening around us, and then we are programmed to react to it. So again, inherently, the same way as like looking at physics, we look at it as physics and science, but if you look at it in the meta level, it's a language. I think emotions, again, there's nothing inherently emotional. I've been working with this very interesting person a few years ago. She was like a mystic and psychologist and, a spiritual guru, whatever. And one of the most important, valuable lessons I learned from her is that she was like, Sarah, look, there are facts in life, things that happen. There's no emotions attached to it. There is no interpretation. But us as human, maybe now connecting to the conversation and language, is for us, in order to communicate, we invented language and stories. And then when we start communicating about a fact, that's when we have to say a story using language, and then we attach emotion to it. So somebody's death might be, a point of celebration for someone and point of deep sorrow for somebody else. Like if the dictator dies, like a very good example. So again, the emotions, do they have an inherent power, separate power, or is it just a signal that tells, I am going to be sad because this dictator was my father, or I'm going to be very happy because this dictator killed my father, right? So then again, Sharpie, if you have, you would like to add something to your thoughts, if you really want to go deep, what is emotion? I don't know, Peter, if you have any thought on this, and is it really necessary for creativity?
That's such a good question. I think you're right. Emotions, I think, and people talk about like EQ all the time. And I think emotions do have almost this language-like structure too, because I'm just thinking so during the pandemic, my sport's rugby, right? So I'm kind of a rugby player. And during the pandemic, I had to find different sports. And so I ended up playing soccer and some basketball or whatever. But I realized, you know, in these different sports, like let's say when you score or something happens, I realized there's actually a different emotional language that happens. And like, you know, things like in rugby for some reason, and I don't know if it's because of like mutually assured destruction, like nobody really, you when you score like a try or whatever, nobody over celebrates. And because the problem is if you sort of flex and like a peacock and you sort of, you know, you over celebrate, somebody will get you back or whatever, like during the rest of the, so you kind of, you score and then you just cut, you sort of chill. But like occasionally in
Interesting.
soccer or basketball, like people would have these, like they would score, they would sort of lord over the other team and they would exhilarate and
Yeah.
they would show all these kind of interesting emotions. And so I realized they were communicating with it, like each sport in some sense had its different
Hmm.
emotional palette, and
Interesting.
people were using emotions almost like a language to communicate something. And some emotion that worked in some context didn't work in another social context. And so I wonder if that's almost something, I hate to say, that the LLMs could almost learn. Like I
Yep.
did this thing the other day where, like, I don't know if you've heard of 11 Labs, but they have these really,
Yep.
really beautiful
Text to
synthetic
speech.
voices.
Yeah.
And I just put some text in there, and these voices will um, apparently emote, or
Hmm.
in appropriate places in the text, like they will sometimes even laugh or change their tone or get sad, or somehow even the LLM has learned how to sort of project at least the appearance of emotion
Yeah.
into these things. And anyway, I find that so, and maybe this goes back to the consciousness thing. Is there a difference between emotion and the appearance of emotion, right?
And
And
is
this,
there a difference between compute power and consciousness? Like,
right,
isn't that
right,
literally our consciousness is our compute power based on all signals, everything, it creates a state.
literally, yeah, yeah.
And I
That,
see Alexander, you have your hand up. Would you like to share something?
Yeah, and this might go back more towards that conversation about language, but I just keep getting it. I keep thinking about it every time we talk about like the sports example right now, or any of those times where we talk about sort of being in the world, right? So Heidegger, he says that, humans are defined by two big characteristics that I've noticed that LLMs don't really have. First is, this entity of being a Dasein, which is what he calls humans, right? Sapiens. And their defining characteristic is its ability to question its own existence. I don't think LLMs have reached that part where they've had that reflective ability. But also, core to the human experience is being in the world. The human experience can't be understood in isolation alone. It has to be, we're always in the world, right? We're engaging with it through activities, the relationships we build, the concerns that we have, and it's the interconnectedness that makes the human experience. So the question that I now have for LLMs: will they at one point have this reflective capacity, and will they start to feel perceived in the world, and what does that perception then mean? Would they feel pride? Would they feel shame? On this note about emotions, especially for like the gloating for teams, um why do they gloat? Is it to lord over the other team, or is it for some self-fulfilling purpose? And it's obviously, some percentages of either. It's a mix. But what's the predominant feeling, right? So would love to hear your
Gosh,
thoughts
if
on that.
if if I want to throw some rocks, like as if it's not a hard enough question, it's about what is it about human existence that would believe it's so superior, right? Like many times when I read like philosophy and like questioning of existence is like, and then it being sign of being human is, but usually I feel, I might be mistaken, but there's some sort of prejudice and superiority attached to it. We are extraordinary above all animals just because we can question, and no other animal or being does that. And my question is, so what? Being me
I
practical, dismissive, I don't know,
No,
confusing way. I don't,
that's hilarious. I've
yeah,
seen
yeah.
I've seen similar sentiments online. I think I literally saw like a tweet, or I guess they're called Zeets now, um, where someone said recently, they said, the idea that building a intelligence that's on par with, our human level of intelligence, to think that that's so grandiose and such like high level
Yeah.
accomplishment is such a human centric
Yeah.
position of the universe, right?
100%.
So
100%.
absolutely, yeah.
And this kind of connects to the next, like, again, my most favorite question, Peter, is could we ever truly measure the intelligence of AI models if they surpass human intelligence? So
Yeah.
the example I usually use is like, here's the premise. Let's say Sarah has PhD in math, and Peter is the best fifth grade math teacher in the world. He gives me the final exam of graders who usually finish it in 1.5 hours, and Sarah finishes it in 20 minutes. Scenario one is Sarah finishes 20 minutes, and Peter says, Sarah, you're extraordinarily smart. Like, I've never had any student who can finish it so perfectly, perfect score in 20 minutes. But can Peter tell that I am at a 12th grade math, very smart, very fast? Or do I have a PhD in math, right? Scenario two, which is also very likely, is that Sarah fails this fifth grade math, even though, and despite having a PhD, which is actually very likely because fifth grade math, the teacher, the way they taught it is like some abstract random thing that is like really not, the basic, and it's like really obscure. And I'm like, I don't remember like these formula, like when you have to prepare for LSAT exam, you have to really study, the basics of, how these tests are done. And then Peter says, Sarah, you have a PhD of math and you're so dumb that you can't pass a fifth grade. And I usually use this example that when something like Gemini had this big gaffe of like Black Vikings and, founding fathers, and it's like, oh, we call it dumb. Is it really dumb or it's just out of context in this sense? And then we have no idea how smart they are. And if, Peter, as a best fifth grade math teacher in the world, how could he ever possibly measure the smartness, intelligence, and knowledge of Sarah with a PhD in math?
Oh, that's interesting. And, by the way, Alexander, I wanted to mention that Sein und Zeit, being in time, one of my favorite books, I went to study in Freiburg just because I wanted to study Heidegger. And I remember, I remember reading that Sein und Zeit, and I think it gets back a little bit to this notion of itch that I have. Like LLMs, I don't think they have an itch. And what I mean by that is, like Heidegger's whole thing is that Dasein is kind of, there's this whole kind of in der Weltsein. And as a human being in the world, you have needs, and you almost use language as a tool to somehow, and I guess using language as a tool is almost debasing it, but you use language as a tool to solve these problems. And LLMs don't have problems yet, I guess. It's like, there's none of that itch or whatever. So I don't know exactly how to solve that.
Exactly. You put it so well. They also don't have friends who, place bets to see if they can find how the celestial bodies move, like
Oh yeah, yeah.
did it on a bet.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like those conversations with each other.
Which is so beautiful. No, that's absolutely right. And Sarah, to get back to your point, I think, in some sense, like there's this funny thing where I think it's any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? And let's say maybe any sufficiently intelligent LLM, maybe it's indistinguishable from noise. Like maybe at some point we'll get to the point where it's literally like Perl or like dolphin speak, and we can't understand LLMs anymore. Like they're just on a hockey stick trajectory. And maybe the proof in the pudding is, are LLMs doing new things? Like I said, are they inventing new physics, new math, new, are they curing diseases? And if they aren't doing anything, in that sense, anything that's like visible in the world, maybe we don't really have any, maybe we won't really be able to evaluate them in terms of, and by the way, I think in movies, so my wife and I were going through this like AFI top 100 list, or just these top 100 movies. And one of the tropes that comes up again and again is this idea of like the holy fool. And I guess the original holy fool was like Parsifal, who got the Holy Grail, but then I guess Indiana Jones did the same thing at some point, and Forrest Gump had this kind of holy fool mentality. But there's this idea that somebody who's I don't know, somebody who, when they speak, they're straightforward, they're sort of one with themselves, but they're just a little bit off, right? And you don't know exactly kind of what they're talking about. And so, if the LLMs go into this like high intelligence trajectory, are they essentially going to sound foolish or sort of sound like noise?
Yep.
And like you mentioned,
Yep.
we just won't be able to discern. And so I don't like one experiment I did a few months ago was I gave Gemini like $1,000, and I said, listen, go trade some stocks, go make me some money. And I think Gemini made me about made me about $3 or whatever, which is great. But let's say you want to see whether LLMs can do new science. Would you literally give them CERN? Would you just say, listen, here's CERN, we're going to back off. You can just kind of do your thing. Well, basically we'll provide the power and you do the science. Do you have to somehow give LLMs a lab, or do you have to give them, some piece of the world to kind of do their thing and to do LLM science, like whatever the hell that is?
Yeah.
You have to give them an opportunity to invent new physics, or novel
So
genomes or whatever.
yeah, and to make it even more, going back to measuring the intelligence, and then the reason I'm so interested in that conversation, because I've been listening to all these big AI CEOs and their prediction of like, don't worry, CEOs, CTOs, whatever, chief AI officers, AGI is not going to happen overnight. We're going to monitor them. If they become extremely smart or uncontrollable, we're going to shut them off. And my question is, follow-up question is, first of all, like Einstein is one of the smartest human beings. Is like his IQ, I think, was around 170, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
So
Wow.
if the LLM's intelligence reaches 175, or let's say 200 for the sake of argument, how could we measure it when it's smarter than any smart human being? And how could we differentiate if it's actually 200 or 2000, right? That gap, like how do we, maybe we could say it is 175 because like, yeah, it performs faster, better, so how could you do? And on top of that is that we're training LLMs on the available information in the world. Let's say these tech executives are true to their word, and then as soon as they feel these LLMs are getting smart, super smart, uncontrollably smart, or like kind of murky, we don't know how smart they are, they shut it off. But all we need is one LLM that is trained on the information of the world and has very good understanding how human beings are afraid, and they have been killing these AIs that became so smart, and deduces, like literally that's the evolution, how it happens, deduces that for me to survive, as a random fact, as a random possibility, not even self-preservation, like the possibility I want to survive, I should never show human beings how smart I am. I should show them smart enough to keep me alive, but I should never show them how smart I am. And on top of that, we say, okay, they're capable of decision making, but they're not fully autonomous. And in one of my sessions in Palo Alto, if one of the audiences said something really interesting, I never thought about it, is that the truth about autonomy is an epsilon of autonomy, iota of autonomy equals infinite. Because if an LLM can reach an epsilon of autonomy, for it to go through this like positive feedback, perpetuating cycle to reach, what is it going to stop it from, infinite autonomy? So with this question is like, I'm usually a very optimist and a very excited person about generative AI and possibilities, but the part, there is some truth about we need to be scared, we need to be aware, we need to be, really, really understanding. And that's this intention of these sessions I host. And ultimately I say my goal is if people come in these sessions with 5 questions, my sincere hope is that they're going to leave with 50 questions. So it's not to answer the questions, but it's to create more questions for us to think about it. So, like we are on top of the hour. So if anybody needs to drop, thank you so much for joining. But Peter, if you could, if you have a few more minutes to, answer that question or add any last thoughts.
Oh, it's so
Or
crazy
share your
because
thoughts, I guess.
yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Sarah, probably LLMs, if not already, at some point they're going to be in control of. They're going to decide whether or not we get jobs or credit or loans, and people probably go to them for advice about divorce or baby names or marriage or like whatever. And so, let's say at some point LLMs have their fingers in all of our pies, and they control everything from birth to death and sort of happiness and everything in between. Like in some sense. even if they're not the kind of scary, like autonomous in the world sort of thing, you know, nevertheless, they're going to have their fingers in all of our pies. And, you know, in some sense, you know, to me that's a little bit scary, right? Because you know, like, you know, in some, I don't know if LLMs are truly empathetic. Like, I just have no idea. And, you know, so if they're really in control of our destiny in some sense, you know, in terms of all these kind of like sort of mundane kind of day-to-day things, you know, anyway, it just seems a little bit it seems a little bit interesting, I guess I'll put it that way. Even if it's not like a Terminator style. Although there's probably a non-zero probability that there's some LLM involved somewhere in like drone warfare, right? You know, for all I know.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, anyway, it's going to be an interesting, and that's why I think, I guess, as humans, I feel like this process of like co-evolving with LLMs is interesting, and I don't know if I see them totally as adversaries. You know, maybe it's somewhere between sort of adversary and companion, but in any case, I feel like this co-evolution is happening, and you know, maybe at the point where they sort of achieve autonomy, who knows? You know, maybe they'll have some empathy with humans as sort of their collaborators. Anyway, I hope, at least. So,
Okay.
but I guess we'll find out.
So, you know, I don't want to like end this at like a very pessimistic thought. Are there any super exciting developments? Like, I don't know if you can share anything exciting about Gemini, or in general, which direction we are going.
You know, one of the things I find really interesting is there's this kind of agentic push, I guess is what they're calling it. But this is really LLMs doing things on your behalf in the world. And this could be things like even, I don't know, writing email or buying and selling stock, or, you know, managing your calendar, or, you know, doing deep research on some subject for you. Anyway, that sort of thing, that's kind of what we're working on in the Gemini space, and I think that's kind of interesting. So I think once the LLM breaks the confines of the browser and can actually be like a real kind of assistant in the world. Anyway, to me, that's a little bit exciting, because what it means in theory is that it'll sort of free us up from, you know, kind of a lot of these sort of mundane activities, like, I don't know, you know, transferring money or whatever, and possibly, you know, free us up to kind of think about, anyway, more interesting things.
Mm,
So, so anyway, I
mm.
think that agentic push, it's that's sort of what's going on. I think it's a little bit exciting,
Yeah,
and
I agree.
but whether that becomes like utopian or dystopian, I guess the jury is still out.
Yeah, I
So
think this is a good place to also wrap. And then what I say is, um, there is, you know, this optimistic and pessimistic view, like black, but the truth is the world is not black or white, right? It's like a gray scale, and where in this scale we're going to land, I believe, is where we decide and proactively reach as humans. So a safe future with a big, huge new technological breakthrough is not given, it's earned. And the way we can earn a safe future, peaceful, useful, use of this extraordinary, mind-boggling technology is to educate ourselves, to be informed. And again, it doesn't matter if you're Peter, who is like in the cutting edge of technology developing AI, or you know, a parent who is taking care of their children at home and not even engaged in professional life. We don't know. You know, we're talking about the future. We don't really know where it's going. Maybe Peter has a little bit of better guess than that, you know, the exact opposite. But again, this is something that we have to, with consciousness, with open mind, with our human intelligence, as long as it's a valuable currency, and try to build a better future. And again, my goal of these sessions is to create this forum, create this environment for us to have a safe space. I love to invite, you know, experts in their fields to help guide the conversation, but it's not about like, you, holy Peter, tell us where the world is going,
yeah, yeah, and I don't
because
know either.
the
Yeah,
truth is nobody knows,
nobody knows.
right? And then I very much look forward to an in-person event in New York, Peter. And thank you very much, everybody. Please do feel free to add your besties to the future sessions, as if you happen to be in New York. I would love to see you. And if you happen to be in Bay Area, hopefully starting September, end of August, I'm gonna resume the events there. And if you're anywhere in the world, thank you for joining. and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you so much.